forest? Well, overwhelmingly, the respondents said, 90% of the respondents said it's fish and wildlife habitat, clean water, clean drinking water. 80% said that it's recreation, abundant recreation opportunities. And about 60% said it's economic development and timber harvest. So that's a good group of data to help guide policy decisions by the Board of Forestry on how we manage the state forests. The state forests have 17 species that are listed or soon to be listed under the endangered species. 5 of those are salmon runs and use our rivers here in northwestern Oregon as well. And also, the North Coast is home to a salmon stronghold where there's a high likelihood, if we manage these lands correctly, that we can recover these endangered species of salmon. Also, our state forests are important to communities. Healthy forests mean healthy communities. The recreation economy in 2019 pumped about $550 million into the economy in the North Coast, generating an estimated $52 million in tax revenue. And also it provides drinking water to 500,000 residents of the Northwest. So there's a huge community benefit to these forests. Unfortunately, for the last few decades, these forests have been managed with really an emphasis on timber production. And just going back a little bit in history too, some of you may remember the 1990s, a property tax limitation measure passed by the voters put the lid on property taxes statewide, and that really put the squeeze on county governments to fund services. Also during the 1990s, the timber industry was able to repeal the timber severance tax, removing an entire revenue source for our counties to pay for essential county services. So what that meant for state forests is there was more pressure on these forests to be logged to provide revenue for county services. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute too. So by 2013, the Oregon Department of Forestry reported that about 13% of our state forest was in complex layered habitat. So the Board of Forestry and the legislature set this goal, let's get that back up to a minimum of 30% layered habitat for these at-risk threatened species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Over the last 10 years, unfortunately, that number has gone down to 11%. As we've continued to harvest this complex layered habitat and have not attained this goal of 30%. In Tillamook County, it's only at 8% of complex layered habitat. So something obviously needs to change and be adjusted with our management of state forests too. A little bit about the revenue split. In the 1950s, early 1950s, a law was passed that directed timber revenue from our state forest to be split between the counties, which would receive a little under 64% of the timber harvest revenue. And the state Department of Forestry gets about 36% of that. There are a few recent numbers, just snapshot up here. Our state forest last year generated 198 million board feet of timber. Sounds like a lot. It is, but compared to private harvest in the state of Oregon, it's a tiny fraction of what's harvested off private lands. Still very important though. $97 million was generated from these timber sales. Clatsop County had 72 million board feet of timber harvested last year. They received 19.2 million. Tillamook, about 47 million board feet off of the Tillamook state forest in Tillamook County. They received 15 million in revenue. I want to mention this though, there's a large backlog of timber recorded by our state forester at Kalamokomoto. In June, it was 308 million board feet. What that means is timber sales that have already been purchased but have not been harvested yet. So that's a lot of revenue that's going to come into the counties over the next 3 years, in addition to current and future timber sales too. So it's looking like county revenue in our state forest is going to be pretty good, even robust over the next 3 years through 2027, according to our state forester. Important to know, because there's been a lot of talk about drastic reductions in revenue from state forests. I wanted just to show you this. This was released about 2 weeks ago, a project that NASA has been working on too. This is Seaside's watershed and logging from 2000 to 2016. Now this is mostly private land, little state land, I think, in the upper right corner here too. But it's just destroyed habitat in Seaside's watershed and also endangered their water source or drinking water source here too. So logging has really increased across the board in the North Coast and private and state forest land too. The interesting thing about this is this kind of timber harvest, this density of harvest puts added pressure on our state forest lands too to protect habitat for endangered species as well. So there definitely is important issue. So right now, the Board of Forestry is working on a habitat conservation plan for our state forest. So what this is intended to do is restore a balance in our state forest where we protect suitable habitat for these 17 listed species and also provide a sustainable level of timber revenue to ensure clean water and safe drinking water as well. So a habitat conservation plan, just a little background on that, it's a way that landowners can comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act to ensure suitable habitat and enough habitat for endangered species to assure their survival. Also, in return for that, landowner has economic uses on the balance of their property. In the context of state forest, what that means is that on roughly half the forest will be able to continue logging. The other half is going to be managed differently. It's going to be managed under ecological forest management. These are not wilderness areas, they're not locked up. Jessica? I have one too, so as somebody pointed out there, thank you. Try not to really discriminate.
Okay, I thought so. Me too.
Great. So they're not locked up, and if anybody says that, they know, this is going to be managed forest land, but it's managed in these habitat conservation areas, really with the goal of conservation, with the goal of over time, over the 70-year lifespan of the habitat conservation plan to result in more habitat for listed species. Just a snapshot of the Astoria district here. The areas inside of the red lines are state forest. The green area is the habitat conservation area. And these areas are to be managed for producing and enhancing habitat for terrestrial species, northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, tree voles, the coastal marten. So they will be managed, they're not locked up again. That's okay. And anyway, I want to keep going though, just to be respectful of our upcoming speakers too. There we go. And then the green lines there are, there we go, okay. Our salmon bearing streams too, there's a 120-foot buffer on each side of these streams for perennial streams. And that's measured horizontally from the bank full line of those streams too. Those are no-cut areas. So that's the only part of this whole plan where there would be no commercial timber harvest, right? And then the rest of the area in pink areas that will be managed as the Department of Forestry has managed these lands in the past. And there will be clear cuts on those lands. Just take a snapshot of the Tillamook district here. Very similar. I think what's notable is this band from the Halem River all the way down to the Wilson of habitat conservation areas, particularly for marbled murrelets and for northern spotted owls too. That in conjunction with this BLM land right there, which is late successional reserve, so it's off limits from large-scale clear cutting, is probably the largest contiguous block of forest that will be protected on the North Coast. This is tens of thousands of acres that will be managed for habitat conservation and not for commercial logging. And then there are 5 important salmon rivers that are in the Tillamook Forest as well. And again, these are strongholds for salmon where there's a high likelihood with the right management that the species can survive and thrive in this area. So the total state forest is 634,500 acres or so. The habitat conservation areas will make up about 43% of the forest. The riparian conservation areas that are outside of those HDAs will be about another 7%. So roughly a little less than half of the forest would be managed for conservation, with the rest of it managed for multiple uses, including timber harvest, where clear cuts will continue, where there will be a continued supply of timber for local mills. I wanted to talk a little bit about the riparian conservation areas. First of all, in this slide, under the preferred alternative for the habitat conservation plan, there's a 120-foot buffer on each side of a perennial fish-bearing stream, right? It's the same in the HCP alternative 3. Where these alternatives differ, and why Wild Salmon Center and all of our partners are supporting alternative 3, is when you get up into the headwaters, into these intermittent streams or perennial but non-fish-bearing streams, it has a 50-foot buffer. And this is supported by the best available science. In fact, this entire plan and everything the Board of Forestry does has to be supported by the best available science. It's the law. There's a new study out on the Trask River that was just published within the last few weeks that looked at the headwaters of the Trask River. And they looked at clear cutting along the headwaters, even these small, non-fish-bearing streams too, and they determined that there are adverse effects to downstream amphibians that are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act from clear cutting next to streams. They even determined that a 12-meter buffer is insufficient to avoid harm to these listed species. So this is it. This is the best available science right here that proves that HCP Alternative 3 needs to be selected by the Board of Forestry and put in place to protect these downstream aquatic species. So for the next steps in December, the Department of Forestry is going to revise the timber harvest projection numbers under the Habitat Conservation Plan. They should be much more accurate numbers, and they're going to present this to the Board of Forestry. There likely is going to be a special board meeting in December as well. Stay tuned for that. Then the Habitat Conservation Plan is supposed to be completed in the late spring of 2024. That means the final environmental impact statement, biological opinion, and record of decision will be issued at that time. So the soonest the board can then adopt this Habitat Conservation Plan would be at their June meeting in 2024, or sometime after that at a special meeting. There we go. So you can help out. Some of you have already signed the petition. You and Emily over here. We're going to pass around petitions. If you haven't signed this yet, please sign up. And you can also sign up for action alerts as well too. The petition signatures we provide to the Board of Forestry, to the governor and elected officials. At the last board meeting on September 7th, we presented 6,400 signatures from residents, many from the North Coast, in support of the Habitat Conservation Plan, and we're keeping this campaign rolling. We want them to hear from people and hear what the greatest permanent value is to the majority of Oregonians, and that's passing on HCP as well. Also, if you sign up for action alerts, we can let you know when the next opportunity for public comment is with the Board of Forestry and help you with that as well. And also, if you're interested in writing a letter to the editors of the local newspapers, we can help you with that as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks, everybody. And